Welcome to Dark Truth Official. And before you do anything else, before you scroll, before your attention drifts even slightly, I want you to focus on something most people ignore every single day. Something so subtle that it hides in plain sight, and yet it controls far more of your life than you realize. Because the truth is, every moment you are around other people, you are being read, not just heard, not hust seen, but read like a pattern, like a signal, like a set of clues that reveal who you are beneath the surface. And the unsettling part is that most of what is being understood about you is not coming from your words. It is coming from your reactions, your hesitation, your timing, your silence, your emotional leaks that you do not even notice. And once you begin to see this clearly, once you recognize that people are constantly forming conclusions about you without needing to think about it consciously, you start to understand something that changes everything. That control is not about what you say. It is about what you reveal without meaning to. And this is not a new idea. This is something that was deeply understood by Niccolò Machiavelli, a man who did not waste time on illusions about how people should behave, but instead studied how they actually behave when power, perception, and self-interest are involved. And one of the most powerful observations hidden in that perspective is that once someone understands your emotional patterns, they do not need to force anything. They do not need to manipulate you in obvious ways, because your predictability begins to do the work for them. And this is where most people lose without realizing they were ever in a position to win, because they believe they are simply being honest, expressive, natural, without understanding that in many environments, especially those shaped by competition, status, or subtle social dynamics, uncontrolled emotional expression is not seen as honesty. It is seen as information, and information in the wrong hands becomes leverage, and leverage, even when used quietly, changes outcomes, changes how people respond to you, changes how seriously you are taken, changes how much influence you have in situations where nothing is explicitly said but everything is quietly decided. And this is why today we are going deeper than surface-level advice. We are looking at 3 emotional patterns that almost everyone displays without thinking. 3 signals that seem harmless but quietly weaken your position over time. And the first one is fear. Not the dramatic kind that is obvious and visible to everyone, but the subtle kind that slips into your behavior without announcing itself. The kind that appears when you hesitate just a second too long before speaking, when you soften your voice slightly because you are unsure how your words will be received, when you over-explain something simple because you want to avoid being misunderstood, when you second-guess your own opinion before anyone else even has the chance to question it. And what makes this dangerous is not the feeling itself, because fear is natural. Fear is part of being human. Fear can even sharpen your awareness. But the problem begins when fear becomes visible in a way that others can detect, because people are incredibly sensitive to uncertainty. Even when they are not consciously aware of it, they feel it, they sense it, and the moment they sense it, their behavior shifts. They interrupt more easily, they challenge more freely, they take your words with less weight, not because they are intentionally trying to undermine you, but because uncertainty invites pressure, and pressure reveals more information. And this becomes a cycle. A subtle but powerful cycle where each small reaction leads to another. Each moment of hesitation reinforces the next, until eventually a pattern is formed. And that pattern becomes your identity in their mind. And once that identity is established, changing it becomes significantly more difficult than maintaining control from the beginning. And this is why understanding the difference between feeling fear and displaying fear is critical, because confidence is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to experience it without allowing it to shape your external behavior in a way that weakens your position. And when you maintain composure, when your reactions remain steady, even under pressure, something very different happens. People become uncertain about you. They cannot easily predict how you will respond, and that uncertainty creates space. And in that space, you gain control. Not through force, not through dominance, but through stability. And this leads directly into the second emotional pattern, which is desperation, a signal that is far more subtle and often more damaging because it disguises itself as effort, as care, as interest. And many people believe that showing how much they want something will increase their chances of getting it. But in reality, the opposite is often true. Because desperation reveals imbalance, it communicates that your emotional state is tied too strongly to a specific outcome. And when that becomes visible, it shifts the dynamic of any interaction, whether it is social, professional, or personal. Because the person who appears less dependent naturally holds more control. And this is not about playing games or pretending not to care. It is about perception, because humans are drawn to those who seem self-contained, those who want things but are not defined by them, those who engage but are not controlled by the need for validation or approval. And the more you display need, the more predictable your behavior becomes. You respond faster than necessary. You give more than is required. You tolerate more than you should. And each of these actions quietly lowers your perceived value. Not because your value has actually changed, but because your behavior suggests that it has. And once that perception forms, it influences how others treat you, how much they invest in you, how seriously they take your presence. And this is why emotional discipline matters, because it allows you to pursue goals, relationships, and opportunities without losing balance, without appearing dependent, without giving away control through visible need. And then there is the third emotional pattern, anger, which is often mistaken for strength because it is loud. It is intense. It commands attention. But in reality, uncontrolled anger is one of the clearest forms of exposure, because it reveals exactly what affects you, what disrupts your control, what triggers a reaction. And once those triggers are visible, they can be repeated, predicted, and used. Not necessarily in obvious ways, but in subtle interactions where someone knows how to push just enough to get a response. And the more reactive you become, the more control you lose. Because your behavior is no longer guided by intention. It is guided by external influence. And this is why true strength is not found in emotional intensity, but in emotional restraint, in the ability to remain steady when provoked, to stay composed when challenged, to think clearly when others lose control. Because composure creates uncertainty, and uncertainty limits how others can interact with you. It forces them to think, to hesitate, to reconsider. And in that hesitation you gain space. And in that space you gain control. And when you look at these three patterns together, fear, desperation, and anger, you begin to see a deeper principle. That power is not about eliminating emotion. It is about managing its expression. About understanding that your internal state does not always need to become external display. And that by controlling what you reveal, you control how you are perceived, and perception, over time, becomes reality in the minds of others. And this is where most people lose without realizing it, because they react too quickly. They express too freely. They allow temporary emotions to create lasting impressions, and those impressions shape how they are treated in the future. And once those patterns are established, they become difficult to change. Because you are not just changing your behavior, you are trying to reshape expectations that have already formed. And that requires consistency over time, which is why it is far more effective to build control early than to repair perception later. And as you begin to apply this awareness, you start to notice things you never saw before. You notice how people react differently to calmness versus intensity. You notice how silence can carry more weight than explanation. You notice how those who are hardest to read are often the ones who hold the most influence. And this realization changes how you move, how you speak, how you respond, because you are no longer acting on impulse. You are acting with intention. And that intention creates a presence that feels stable, grounded, and difficult to disrupt. And over time, that presence becomes your advantage, not because it is loud or aggressive, but because it is consistent, and consistency builds trust, respect, and influence in ways that cannot be forced. And this is where the real shift happens, when you stop trying to control everything around you and start focusing on controlling what you reveal. Because once you control your reactions, your expressions, your signals, you control how others interpret you. And once you control perception, you begin to influence outcomes without needing to push, without needing to prove, without needing to react. And that is where real power exists. Not in dominance, not in force, but in quiet, deliberate control that others can feel but cannot easily define. And once you reach that point, you begin to understand something most people never fully grasp. That the strongest position you can be in is one where your emotions exist, but do not control you. Where your reactions are chosen, not triggered. Where your presence is steady regardless of the situation. And that level of control is rare, not because it is impossible, but because it requires awareness, discipline, and patience, qualities that most people never take the time to develop. But now you have seen it. Now you are aware of it. And once you are aware, you have a choice to continue reacting as before, or to begin observing, adjusting, and refining how you present yourself to the world. Because every moment is an opportunity to either reveal too much or maintain control. And over time, those moments define how you are perceived, how you are treated, and how much influence you truly have. And once you start making those choices consciously, everything begins to shift in subtle but powerful ways. This has been Dark Truth Official. If this video made you think differently, if it made you look at the world around you and see something you did not see before, then it has done exactly what it was meant to do. Subscribe, because the next video goes even deeper. And trust me, you are not going to want to miss it.